I'm grounded in compassion, centered in compassion, 'cause the most important person is me.
Well, hello, beautiful people. Here's something that came up in a meaningful conversation this week. And here's what it taught me, about compassion in real life. We're talking about what happens when we feel challenged, corrected, or misunderstood, or when someone sees a situation very differently than we do. And one question stayed with me. What is my relationship with being wrong? Not whether I like being wrong, most of us don't, but what happens inside of me when I think I might be? Do I become defensive? Do I immediately start explaining? Do I need the other person to understand my side? Or do I become quieter, sharper, more distant? Or do I start building a case in my mind for why I'm right? Welcome, everyone, to Real Life, Real Compassion. I'm Dr. Belinda Douglas, and this is where we explore what compassion looks like in the middle of ordinary life. Real emotions, real relationships, real challenges, and those moments that sometimes teach us more about ourselves than we expected to learn. During this conversation that I had, someone said something that really stayed with me. He said we need to develop the right relationship with being wrong. I thought that was powerful because being wrong about something doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. Being corrected doesn't mean I'm inadequate. Changing my mind doesn't make me weak. And hearing another person's perspective doesn't require me to abandon my own. But sometimes our nervous system doesn't experience it that way. Sometimes being questioned can feel threatening. Being corrected can feel embarrassing, and being misunderstood can feel personal. And before we even realize what's happening, we may begin protecting ourselves. And that's where compassion can make a huge difference. Compassion gives us enough inner steadiness to become curious about what's happening instead of immediately reacting to it. In compassion training, we spend a lot of time developing awareness, noticing our thoughts, noticing the accompanying emotions, and noticing the stories we begin telling ourselves. Because sometimes the internal conversation is not only part of what's happening, there's also an internal conversation, about other things. Maybe someone says, I think you could have handled that differently. And inside we hear, they don't respect me. Or someone offers another perspective and internally we hear, they don't think I know what I'm doing. Those are not necessarily the same thing. But once that inner story starts running, it can shape everything that happens next. I had an experience recently that helped me notice this in myself. I was preparing to give a presentation that mattered a great deal to me, and I had to put time into it. I wanted to do well, and then I started having technical problems. Things weren't working the way I had planned, and I could feel myself becoming emotional. At one level, I, was simply frustrated. But then I looked at, it a little deeper. I realized there was more underneath it. I was attached to how I thought the experience should go. I wanted people to see the work the way I had prepared it. And there was some vulnerability there too. What will people think? Will this reflect badly on me? Will they understand how much work went into this? Now, compassion, doesn't tell me that I shouldn't care. It doesn't tell me that the emotions are wrong. Instead, compassion invites me to understand them. What am I protecting right now? That's a very different question. And I think that's an important question for all of us. When we become defensive, what are we trying to protect? Our reputation, our sense of competency, our dignity, our need to feel respected, our need to feel heard, our fear of rejection, or maybe even an old wound that has very little to do with the person standing in front of us. And this is where awareness begins, it becomes powerful, because when we can notice what's happening inside of us, we can create a little more room between the feeling and the response. And in that room, we have choices. Another part of that conversation focused on the idea of rebuilding our inner structures. I really like that language, because once we recognize a pattern, the work isn't finished. Awareness gives us a starting point. Then we begin practicing something different. Maybe we're rebuilding trust. Maybe we're rebuilding the way we listen. Maybe we're learning how to receive feedback without immediately defending ourselves. And maybe we're developing emotional regulation. Maybe we're learning to set boundaries without hostility. Maybe learning how to disagree without disconnecting. That kind of rebuilding usually doesn't happen all at once. It happens one response at a time, one conversation at a time, one pause at a time. And that's where compassion becomes very practical. Imagine yourself in a conversation and you feel that familiar tightening. Maybe your chest becomes tense. Maybe your thoughts start racing up, speeding up. And maybe you immediately know what you want to say back. That's a moment to notice, not judge. Just notice. You might quietly say to yourself, something in me feels threatened right now. And then take one breath. Not because one breath magically fixes everything, but because that breath gives you a moment to come back to yourself. And then ask, what am I protecting? Perhaps one more question. What response would help rather than simply defend? Sometimes the answer would be listening. Sometimes explaining, and sometimes maybe apologizing. Sometimes it may mean simply saying, I need a moment to think about what you've said. And sometimes compassion may involve a clear boundary. Compassion doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean allowing someone to mistreat you. It doesn't mean trying to respond from greater clarity. It does mean that, rather than simply reacting. Think about a recent moment when you felt defensive. Maybe it was overwhelming, or, just an ordinary interaction. Maybe you felt criticized, misunderstood, or corrected. Or maybe someone simply disagreed. Notice what happened inside you. What did your body do? What thoughts showed up? What story did you begin telling yourself? And then gently ask, without judgment, without, just being curious. Ask, how might compassionate response have looked like in that moment? Maybe the answer is exactly what you did. Or maybe it's looking back. You can see another possibility. That's part of growth too. Something else emerged from that conversation that I think matters. There's a kind of strength that comes from not having to prove ourselves all the time. I think of that as mature strength. Mature strength can listen. Mature strength can be corrected, can change its mind. It can say, you know what, I was wrong. And mature strength can also say, I hear you, and I still see it differently, without turning disagreement into a battle. That kind of strength often gives us access to a wider perspective. We can begin to see others more clearly. We can see ourselves more clearly. And sometimes we can see that the real issue isn't who won the argument. The real issue is what happened in the relationship, what happened inside us, and whether the way we respond moved us toward greater understanding or further away from it. So this week, here's what I want you to notice. When you feel the need to prove that you're right, and underneath that, you might actually, notice what you're protecting. Then notice what happens if you give yourself permission not to solve everything immediately. You can pause. You can listen. You can reflect. You can come back to the conversation. You can learn something and still maintain your dignity. You can discover that you were wrong about one thing without making yourself wrong as a person. And that's self-compassion. And it also creates more room for compassion towards the other person. Transformation often happens in very small moments. A moment when we could defend, but choose to listen. A moment when we could attack, but choose curiosity. A moment when we could insist on being understood, but become willing to understand. A moment when we recognize this is the way I usually respond, and then realize we have another choice. That's real life, real compassion. Take care of yourself this week and notice what happens inside of you. Give yourself room to learn. Give other people room to be human too. And remember, sometimes the strongest thing we can do is loosen our grip on the need to be right long enough to discover what the moment may be teaching us. I'll see you next time on Real Life, Real Compassion.
I'm grounded in compassion, centered in compassion, 'cause the most important person is me.